Here in section 3 of chapter 12, we're going to talk about the life and culture in the West. Now, the dream of creating a democratic utopia in the West ultimately rested on those who picked up their possessions and their families and moved west. Western settlers usually migrated as families and settled along navigable and potable rivers. Settlements often coalesced around local traditions, especially religion, carried from these eastern settlements. These shared understandings encouraged a strong sense of cooperation among Western settlers that forged communities on the frontier. Before the Mexican War, the West, for most Americans, still referred to the very fertile area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, with a slight amount of overspill beyond its banks. Which you do need to know that definition of what many people considered the West prior to the Mexican-American War for quiz purposes. With soil exhaustion and land competition increasing in the East, most early Western migrants sought a great measure of stability and self-sufficiency by engaging in small-scale farming. Boosters of these new agricultural areas, along with the U.S. government, encouraged perceptions of the West as a land of hard-built opportunity that promised personal and national bounty. Women migrants bore the unique double burden of travel while also being expected to conform to the restrictive gender norms. The key virtues of femininity, according to the cult of true womanhood, included piety, purity, domesticity, and submissiveness. The concept of separate spheres expected women to remain in the home. These values accompanied men and women as they traveled west to begin their new lives. While many of these social standards endured, there often existed an openness of frontier society that resulted in modestly more opportunities for women. Husbands needed partners in setting up the homestead and working in the field to provide food for the family. Suitable wives were often in short supply, enabling some to informally negotiate more power in their households. Americans debate the role of the government in Western expansion also. It really centered on the proper role of the U.S. government in paying for the internal improvements that would soon become necessary to encourage and support economic development. Some saw frontier development as self-driven undertaking that necessitated private risk and investment, devoid of government interference. Others saw the federal government's role as providing the infrastructure development needed to give migrants the push towards engagement with the larger national economy. In the end, federal aid proved essential for the conquest and settlement of the region. Economic bust constantly threatened Western farmers and communities, though. The economy worsened after the Panic of 1819. Falling prices and depleted soil meant that farmers were unable to make their loan payments. The dream of sustenance and stability abruptly ended as many migrants lost their land and felt the hand of the distant market economy forcing them even further west to escape debt. As a result, the federal government consistently sought to increase access to that land in the West, including efforts to lower the amount of land required for purchase. Smaller lots made it easier for more farmers to clear land and begin farming faster. More than anything else, new roads and canals provided conduits for migration and settlement. Improvements in travel and exchange fueled economic growth in the 1820s and 30s. Canal improvements expanded in the East while road building prevailed in the West. Congress continued to allocate funds for internal improvements. Federal money pushed the National Road, which began in 1811, farther west every year. Laborers needed to construct these improvements, increased employment opportunities, and encouraged non-farmers to move to the West as well. Wealth promised by engagement with the new economy was hard to reject. However, roads were expensive to build and maintain, and some Americans strongly opposed spending money on those improvements. The use of steamboats grew quickly throughout the 1810s and into the 1820s. As water trade and travel grew in popularity, local, state, and federal funds helped connect rivers and streams. Hundreds of miles of new canals cut through the eastern landscape. The most notable of these early projects was the Erie Canal. That project, completed in 1825, linked the Great Lakes to New York City. And for quiz purposes, you need to know that the profitability of the Erie Canal really helped New York outpace its East Coast rivals to become the center for commercial import and export in the United States. Early railroads like the Baltimore and Ohio line hoped to link mid-Atlantic cities to the lucrative western trade routes. Railroads' boosters encouraged the rapid growth of towns and cities along their routes. Not only did rail lines promise to move commerce faster, but the rails encouraged the spreading of towns further away from traditional waterway locations. Technological limitations, constant repairs, conflicts with American Indians, and political disagreements all hampered railroading and kept canals and steamboats as integral parts of transportation system. Nonetheless, this early establishment of railroads enabled a rapid expansion after the Civil War. Economic chains of interdependence that stretched hundreds of miles of land and through thousands of contracts and remittances. America's manifest destiny became wedded not only to territorial expansion, but also to economic development. In the fourth section, we're going to talk about Texas, Mexico, and America. The debate over slavery became one of the prime forces behind the Texas Revolution and the resulting republic's annexation into the United States. After gaining its independence from Spain in 1820, Mexico hoped to attract new settlers to the northern areas to create a buffer state between the powerful Comanche Empire, which you need to know for quiz purposes, that this is why they wanted new settlers in the northern areas. New immigrants, mostly from the southern United States, poured into Mexican Texas. Over the next 25 years, concerns over growing Anglo influence and possible American designs on the area produced friction between Mexicans and the former Americans in the area. In 1829, Mexico hoped to quell both anger and immigration, outlawed slavery, and required all new immigrants to convert to Catholicism. American immigrants eager to expand their agricultural fortunes largely ignored these requirements. But in response, Mexican authorities closed their territory to any new immigration in 1830, a prohibition that was also ignored by Americans, who often just squatted on public lands. In 1834, an internal conflict between Federalists and Centralists in the Mexican government led to the political ascendancy of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Governing as a dictator, he repudiated the Federalist Constitution of 1824 and pursued a policy of authoritarian central control and crushed several revolts throughout Mexico. Anglo settlers in Mexican Texas, or Texians as they called themselves, opposed Santa Anna's centralizing policies and met in November. They issued statement of purpose that emphasized their commitment to the Constitution of 1824 and declared Texas to be a separate state within Mexico. After the Mexican government angrily rejected this offer, Texian leaders soon abandoned their fight for the Constitution and declared independence on March 2, 1836. The Texas Revolution of 1835 and 1836 was a successful secessionist movement in northern district of the Mexican state of Coahuila y Tejas that resulted in independent Republic of Texas. At the Alamo and Goliad, Santa Anna crushed smaller rebel forces and massacred hundreds of Texian prisoners. The Mexican army pursued the retreating Texas army deep into East Texas, spurring a massive panic and evacuation by American civilians, known as the Runaway Scrape. The confident Santa Anna consistently failed to make adequate defensive preparations, an oversight that eventually led to a surprise attack by the outnumbered Texian army led by Sam Houston on April 21, 1836. The Battle of San Jacinto lasted only 18 minutes and resulted in a decisive victory for the Texians, who retaliated for previous Mexican atrocities by killing, fleeing, and surrendering Mexican soldiers for hours after the initial assault. Santa Anna was captured in the aftermath and compelled to sign the Treaty of Velasco, by which he agreed to withdraw his army from Texas and acknowledge Texas's independence. Although the new Mexican government never recognized the Republic of Texas, the United States and several nations gave the new country diplomatic recognition. Texas's annexation had remained a political landmine since the Republic declared independence from Mexico in 1836. American politicians feared that adding Texas to the Union would provoke a war with Mexico and reignite sectional tensions by throwing off the balance between free and slave states. However, after his expulsion from the Whig Party, President John Tyler saw Texas statehood as a key to saving his political career. And in 1842, he began work on opening annexation to national debate. Harnessing public outcry over the issue, Democrat James K. Polk rose from virtual obscurity to win the presidential election of 1844. Polk and his party campaigned on promises of westward expansion, with eyes towards Texas, Oregon, and California. In the final days of his presidency, Tyler at last extended an official offer to Texas on March 3rd of 1845, and the Republic accepted on July 4th, becoming the 28th state. Mexico denounced annexation as an act of aggression, the most unjust which can be found recorded in the annals of modern history. Beyond the anger produced by annexation, the two nations both laid claim over a narrow strip of land between the two rivers. Mexico drew the southwestern border of Texas at the Neches River, but Texans claimed that the border lay roughly 150 miles farther west at the Rio Grande. Neither claim was realistic, since the sparsely populated area known as the Neches Strip was in fact controlled by the Native Americans. In November of 1845, Polk secretly dispatched John Slidell to Mexico City to purchase the Natchez Strip along with sections of New Mexico and California. The mission was an empty gesture, designed largely to pacify those in Washington who insisted on diplomacy before war. Predictably, officials in Mexico City refused to receive him, and in preparation for the assumed failure of the negotiations, Polk preemptively sent a 4,000-man army under the General Zachary Taylor to Corpus Christi, Texas, just northeast of the Natchez River. Upon word of Slidell's rebuff, Polk ordered Taylor to cross the disputed territory, and the president hoped that this show of force would push the lands of California onto the bargaining table as well. Unfortunately, he really misread the situation, and after losing Texas, the Mexican public strongly opposed surrendering any more ground to the United States. Popular opinion left the shaky government in Mexico City without room to negotiate. And on April 24th, Mexican cavalrymen attacked a detachment of Taylor's troop in the disputed territory just north of the Rio Grande, killing 11 soldiers. It took 2 weeks for the news to reach Washington, and Polk sent a message to Congress on May 11th that summed up the assumptions and intentions of the United States. Instead of this, however, we have been exerting our best efforts to propitiate her goodwill, upon the pretext that Texas, a nation as independent as herself, thought proper to unite its destinies with our own. She is affected to believe that we have served her rightful territory, and an official proclamations of manifestos has repeatedly threatened to make war upon us for the purpose of reconquering Texas. In the meantime, we have tried every effort to reconcile. The cup of forbearance has been exhausted, even before the recent information from the frontier of the Del Norte. But now, after reiterate menaces, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood on American soil. She has proclaimed that hostilities have commenced, and the two nations are now at war. The KG Polk knew that since hostilities already existed, political dissent would be dangerous. A vote against war became a vote against supporting American soldiers under fire. Congress passed the declaration of war on May 13th. Only a few opposed the measure. Upon declaring war, Congress issued a call for 50,000 volunteer soldiers. Spurred by promises of adventure and conquest abroad, thousands of men flocked to assembly points across the country. However, opposition to Mr. Polk's war soon grew. In the fall of 1846, the U.S. Army invaded Mexico on multiple fronts, and within a year's time, General Winfield Scott's men took control of Mexico City. But the city's fall did not bring an end to the war. They occupied Mexico's capital for 4 months while the two countries negotiated. In the United States, the war had been controversial from the beginning, and journalists sent back detailed reports from the front line, and the divided press viciously debated the news. Volunteers found that the war was not as they expected. Disease killed 7 times as many soldiers as combat. Harsh discipline, conflict within the ranks, and violent clashes with civilian soldiers led to large numbers to desert. Peace finally came on February 2nd of 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And for quiz purposes, you need to understand that the United States gained land that would become the future states of California, Utah, Nevada, most of Arizona, parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. Mexican officials would have to surrender their claims to Texas and recognize the Rio Grande as the southern boundary, and the United States offered $15 million for all of it. With the American soldiers occupying their capital, Mexican leaders had no choice but to sign it. The new American Southwest attracted a diverse group of entrepreneurs and settlers to the commercial towns of New Mexico, the fertile lands of East Texas, the famed gold deposits of California, and the Rocky Mountains. The post-war migration built earlier paths dating back to the 1820s, when the lucrative Santa Fe trade enticed merchants to New Mexico, and generous land grants brought numerous settlers to Texas. The Gadsden Purchase of 1854 further added to the American gains of the north of Mexico. The U.S.-Mexican War had an enormous impact on both countries. And for quiz purposes, you need to understand that the American victory helped set the United States on a path becoming a world power. It also elevated Zachary Taylor to the presidency and served as a training ground for many of the Civil War's future commanders. Most significantly, however, Mexico lost half its territory. The United States victory was not without danger, though, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, an outspoken critic, predicted ominously at the beginning of the conflict, "We will conquer Mexico, but it will be as the man who swallows the arsenic, which will bring him down in turn. Mexico will poison us." Indeed, the conflict over whether to extend slavery in the newly won territory pushed the nation even closer to disunion and civil war.